Where do we get Yahweh from? So Yahweh, and really from a New Testament perspective, really this comes down to when Yeshua says that I declared the name of the Father to his disciples. Did he declare to them Yahweh, or did he declare to them Yehovah, or maybe something else, right? Maybe it was, I've said in the past, maybe if we don't know what the vowels are, it could be anything. It could be Yuhu, Vuhu, right? It could be, it could be anything. Now we have over 1,000 Hebrew manuscripts that verify that it's Yehovah. But why is it that all these people think it's Yahweh?
Okay, let me stop you right there, just for a minute.
Yeah.
Because 20 years ago, I did several videos in the land of Israel, and in which I was speaking the name as Yahweh. I was doing that.
Yeah.
And the information that you're about to share with us, I didn't want to listen to. I didn't want to hear what you had to say, and I had to admit it to myself that I didn't want to listen because I already staked my flag on the name of Yahweh. I'd already done videos that have gone out by the hundreds of thousands all around the world, and I had a stake in that. But yet, as this information, as you started bringing this out, it finally came to a point that I can't ignore this. I can't ignore this. And even though I've in 1,000,006 videos I have, and I'm pronouncing the name Yahweh, I finally had to change because the information was there and the revelation also came. We won't go into that, but I'm saying that I had a vested interest in my personal opinion.
Well, it's not just invested in DVDs. You're emotionally invested in this for years. I think that's it's really a powerful thing, being emotionally invested in things. And what what you did was the best you knew how to do at the time. And I believe that Yehovah honors that. Now we can do better, though. And what I love about you, Michael, is you heard this information and you said, you know what, I can do better. And you made the shift, and you're now saying Yehovah. I want to explain to people where Yahweh comes from.
Okay, please do.
Because for 200 years, the world has been deceived. And not really the Jewish world. The Jewish world doesn't know anything about this. The academic, scholarly world, which then spilled over into the Christian world, has been deceived by this information. I think it's deception. And when I dug into where it came from, I was shocked. Because where it came from is Gesenius. Gesenius is the great grammarian of Hebrew grammar. To this day, the primary lexicons of biblical Hebrew, Brown Diver Briggs and Halot, Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, are based on the work of Gesenius in the 1800s. And the primary grammar at Hebrew University, I would sit with these in these classes, and these the professor would assign an assignment to go check in the Hebrew grammar. And the grammar of biblical Hebrew isn't in Hebrew. It's in English or German, written by Gesenius. So we had students I was sitting with who were native Hebrew speakers who would come to me and say, can you help us? Our English isn't good enough. Help. I'm like, yeah, I could read this. It's English. It's my native language. And so Gesenius' Hebrew grammar is really the foundation of modern Hebrew, of biblical studies in Hebrew.
And even today at Hebrew University.
At Hebrew University, and rightfully so. He did groundbreaking work. What he really did is he collected things that were done by other people over centuries, and he put them, as Germans are quite good at doing, and especially in the past, is doing things in a systematic way. And so he was very systematic. He is wonderful. I consult Gesenius almost every day, Michael. I'm not saying he's a bad grammar. I'm just saying he didn't get everything right. And if you look at the earlier versions of his dictionary in particular, you get a glimpse into his thought pattern of where he was the one who championed Yahweh and convinced the scholarly world it should be Yahweh, because it was a debate in the Christian world up until then. Meaning Yahweh doesn't appear until 1599. That's the first time it appears in the writings of a man named Gilbert Genebard. And then it's debated for a couple hundred years by the Christians, is it Yehovah, which the Jews seem to think it is, or is it Yahweh? And then Gesenius ends the discussion, it's Yahweh. And he brings two pieces of evidence, which shocked me because I didn't know this until relatively recently. And he says this in the 1833 edition of his dictionary, which was translated in 1857 into English. And in the dictionary, this part I actually didn't know, the first part. So the first part is that the main source for Yahweh is a Christian church father named Theodoret of Cyrus, who lived at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century AD. And what Theodoret of Cyrus says is he's talking about the name, and he makes a statement that is quoted in certainly every scholarly work on this topic as evidence for Yahweh. And what Theodoret says in his questions on Exodus, chapter 7, question number 15, he says the Samaritans call it Jahve, while the Jews call it Ayah, which is really interesting because at first you think he's talking about the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, right? And that's what's understood certainly when it comes to the Samaritans. But he says the Jews call God's name Ayah. Well, what's Ayah? So years ago I suggested that Ayah, which supposedly the Jews refer to God as, was a corruption of the Yah that you have in Hallelujah. And that's definitely a possibility. Meaning he's not even talking about the Tetragrammaton when it comes to the Jews, because by the time of Theodoret of Cyrus, there were very small number of Jews who still spoke the name. It was kept as a secret among the rabbis. And certainly this Gentile wouldn't have heard it. Like, that makes no sense that this Christian from from Cyrus and Theodoret, not Cyprus, by the way, that he would have heard this. It doesn't make sense. So where did they hear this from? And how did he get this information from the Samaritans? Remember, we just heard from Josephus that in 168 BC, the Samaritans didn't speak the name of the God of Israel. In fact, they had they referred to God by no name, anonymous, and then they rededicated their temple to Zeus or Jupiter. So that was 168 BC, and now we're being told sometime around 500 AD by Theodoret of Cyrus, at 700 years later, that the Samaritans pronounce God's name as Jahve. So where does he get that? So there's a number of possibilities. One is, well, maybe there was some faction of Samaritans who did speak it. I don't know. There isn't really evidence for that. What some scholars suggest, and by the way, this is Gesenius's basis for Yahweh. This statement by Theodoret, what I just read to you, that is the only solid proof of any kind for Yahweh. Is this statement by Theodoret, who's quoting the Samaritans. By the way, Theodoret didn't know Hebrew. The Samaritans weren't even Israelites, so their form of Hebrew was a corrupt form of Hebrew based on the northern dialect, but it was corrupted over time. They don't have the hey sound, for example. This gentleman, the scholar, Samaritan scholar, he says to me, the name of God means Hayah Hoveh Hiyah. I said, well, how do you pronounce it in Samaritan Hebrew? Hayah, he says, is Abba. Hoveh, he says, is Ebi. Yihiyah is Yebi. Right, so you can see some remnant there of Hebrew, but their Hebrew is different than the Hebrew that was preserved by the Jewish people. It comes from a different dialect, and that was corrupted over time. So how on earth does Theodoret know what the Samaritans call the God of Israel? So one possibility is that, he heard them say some other word, and he just didn't really, or he heard maybe third or fourth hand, right? Because I doubt he ever met a Samaritan. So somehow the word gets to him that they refer to God as Yahweh or Yahweh. What they might have actually been referring to is what we saw in Exodus 3:14, and other scholars have suggested this. That in Exodus 3:14, we saw that God is called Ehyeh. He says, I am, and then he says, this is what you'll call me for the rest of time, is Yud He Vav He, which is he was, he is, he will be. But Yahweh actually would be pronounced in certain periods of history of Greek as Iaveh. Well, Iaveh could be a form of Ehyeh. And that's what some scholars have suggested. This is simply a corruption of Ehyeh and has therefore nothing to do with the Tetragrammaton. Because in this period, the Samaritans didn't even speak the name. There's another possibility which I find really scary, and it's possible this is true. So, the Samaritans we heard about from Josephus rededicated their temple to Jupiter. Well, what's Jupiter called in Latin? In Latin, he's not called Jupiter. First of all, there's no J in Latin, right? So in Latin, he's called Jupiter. And I actually spoke to an expert in Latin to confirm this. So today in Latin, they say Jove or Jove for Jupiter.
Right.
But in early, and that's where you get in English where Sherlock Holmes says, oh, by Jove, I think I've got it. He's saying, by Jupiter. What are you saying? You're saying by Jupiter. That's what he was saying. Can you believe that? I don't know what the English were thinking back then in the 1800s. But anyway, there's different forms of Jupiter. And I don't want to get too complicated here, but there are different, what they call cases in Latin. So there's Jupiter, Jovis, Jovi, Jovum, Jove, Jupiter. But basically in the early Latin, it wasn't a V, it was a W. And so it wasn't pronounced Jove, it was pronounced Yoe in Latin 2,000 years ago. So now we have this word Yoe, and where do we get Jupiter from Yoe? Jupiter is Yoepater, Father Yoe. That is the name of Jupiter. That was the god of the Latins, Yoe. And I heard that, I'm like, that sounds awfully like Yahweh. And we know that the Samaritans dedicated their temple to Jupiter, Jupiter of the Greeks. So maybe if you went to a Samaritan and said, what's the name of the God in that temple? He would say to you, that's Father Yahweh, Yahweh Pater. So wait a minute. So maybe this is what they heard from the Samaritans. It's just not the name of Yahve, the God of Israel. Now you say, okay, come on. Gesenius isn't going to fall for that. He knew Greek, he knew Latin. He learned Greek and Latin before he learned Hebrew. He was a solid German scholar. Back then, even in your day, I think people learned Latin, right? And in the earlier generations, Europeans and people from the West learned Greek and Latin really well. And so he knew about Yahweh being the name of Jupiter. And you think, how could there be any connection between what he said, what Gesenius, this great German scholar of Hebraic studies, said, and Jupiter? Well, he actually admits that there is. Let me read you what he says. And I saw this, and I'm like, there it is. It's the smoking gun. These are the words of Gesenius in his 1857 edition of his dictionary. He says, I suppose this word, referring to Yahweh, and earlier in the paragraph, he says, hey, this comes from the Samaritans, Jahve, which is Yahweh. I suppose this word to be one of the most remote antiquity, perhaps is the same origin as Jovis, which is Jois, and Jupiter, meaning Jove and Jupiter, and transferred from the Egyptians to the Hebrews. So, what? So in other words, Gesenius is telling us we have two pieces of information here. We have a name for God from the Samaritans, which is Jahve, which sounds awfully like, which he believes would originally have been Yahweh. And Yahweh sounds awfully like Yahweh of the Latins. And we have, so we have that. In other words, we have this statement by Theodoret connecting it to the Samaritan Jahve, which he thinks is Yahweh. And we have this Latin god called Yahweh. He says these two things can't be a coincidence. It must be that both the Hebrews and the Latins come from worship some ancient deity who was called Yahweh or Yahweh. And they both then separated into different places. The Latins went to Italy. The Israelites went to Israel. And they both continued to call upon this name with a slightly different pronunciation. The Latins as Yahweh and the Hebrews as Yahweh.
And he's suggesting that it came from the Egyptians?
And it came from the Egyptians, he claims. Now, he wrote this originally in 1833. And that's significant because at that time, they didn't really know what hieroglyphics meant. In other words, they hadn't fully deciphered the hieroglyphics. And so you could kind of say anything you wanted about the ancient Egyptians, right?
They did.
And they did, right? Right. I mean, famously, there was, one particular group who said, yes, we have this document in hieroglyphics. Here's our translation of it. Turns out they just made that all up. Once scholars actually deciphered hieroglyphics.
That's embarrassing for Salt Lake City.
Yeah, you said that. In any event, so here you have him saying explicitly, he's tying together Yahweh of the Samaritans in Theodoret, and the Yahweh of Jupiter of the Latins, and saying, yeah, they both got that from the Egyptians. Well, I saw this. I said, wait a minute. So your proof for Yahweh, the great scholar who advocates for Yahweh, is telling us it's the name of a pagan deity. And it's the name of some Egyptian deity that both the Latins and the Hebrews worship. Well, first of all, if it's the name of a pagan deity, then it doesn't mean he was, he is, and he is to come.
Right.
And he claims it doesn't mean that because he bases it on a Hebrew form that is, I won't get into too complicated stuff, but it's the He-Phil form, and the name Yehovah, which comes from Hayahoveh Hieh, comes from the Kal form. It's a different form of the verb. And the name Yehovah can mean he was, he is, he is to come. Yahweh can't mean that. It doesn't have that meaning. The actual meaning of Yahweh is unclear as well, if it means anything. And why is it unclear? Because they believed it came from some Egyptian deity, so it isn't even Hebrew. I was actually just at the SBL conference in Society of Biblical Literature, and this woman gave a lecture, and she says, this isn't a Hebrew name. This is an ancient pagan name. Today, in this century, people are still saying the same thing. This was in November 2017. A serious scholar was giving a paper saying this is the name of a pagan deity that transferred from other languages eventually into Hebrew. And if you want to know the name of the meaning of the word, don't look in Hebrew. Look at these other pagan languages. So what he was saying back then in 1833, what Gesenius was saying, is still being advocated by people today. Now, Michael, when I heard this, I mean, I'm a, some people make fun of me. They say that I'm really liberal because, look, I say if you want to call him Yahweh, call him Yahweh. And I still say that. But at least know what the background of Yahweh is and where it comes from. Now, the God of Israel, I believe, is far more merciful than we are. And so, I mean, I don't want people to hear this and say, oh, no, I've been praying to the wrong God. You haven't been praying to the wrong God. You were doing the best you could with what you had. But now you've got better information, and you should be convicted by that. You need to follow the truth when you discover it. I want to read a passage from Psalm 44. I talk about this passage. This was a life-changing passage for me, Michael. It's a verse in Psalm 44. I talk about it in my book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. I have a whole section on that in my book. So it's talking in Psalm 44 about the Israelites being taken into exile. If you read the whole context here, they're taken into exile. They're captives in a foreign land. And then they say in verse 20 in the English, 21 in the Hebrew. Let me read the Hebrew. It says, Im shachachnu shem Eloheinu. If we forgot the name of our God, v'nifros kapenu le'el zar, and we stretched out our hands, our palms to a foreign God. What does that mean? The way the Israelites would pray, I do this, and some people say, are you a Pentecostal? No, I'm praying like an Israelite. This is how the Israelites would pray. They would stretch up their hands to God, raising their hands. He says, if we forgot the name of our God and we stretched out our palms to a foreign deity, Halo Elohim yachakor zot, will God not investigate this? Ki hu yodea talumot lev, for he knows the mysteries of the heart. That is, I'm in a foreign land, and I grew up being told, you're not allowed to say the name of your God. We have this concept in Judaism, tinok shenishba. And it refers to a time in history, which actually has come back, unfortunately. It literally means the baby who is taken captive by pirates. It refers to a time in history when Jews would travel the Mediterranean, and there were these Muslim pirates, the Barbary pirates. Right. Thomas Jefferson dealt with them.
Oh, yeah.
But Jews were dealing...
had to go to the shore of Tripoli.
Right, that's the shores of Tripoli. Right. So this was a problem for Jews for over 1,000 years, living in the Mediterranean, that Jewish babies would be captured. And then they would meet their father years later, and the child would have been raised as a Muslim. And so rabbis discussed, they said the Tinok Shenishba, the baby that was captured by the pirates, Jews are supposed to follow the Torah, we're taught. But this Jew doesn't know any better. He was captured by pirates. And as I'm sharing this, I'm realizing Gesenius in some way was a linguistic pirate. He captured the hearts of billions of people for the last 200 years to tell them, hey guys, it's Yahweh. And if you read my books, you'll find out I also think Yahweh is a pagan deity. It's right there in his book. He's telling you Yahweh is the name of some Egyptian deity that's also worshipped by the Latins. And that's why it's Yahweh, because it fits Yahweh, the Jupiter form. So, we're in a world where we've been lied to and deceived for 200 years, and now we're like that baby who was taken captive by the pirates and meets his father and realizes, in my heart, I feel that I'm a Jew. In my heart, I feel the God of Israel and the truth. And when I hear it, I can repent. Now, I'm not going to be judged for what I did when I didn't know any better. That's the idea of Tinok Shenishba. But now that I know, and my heart is stirred, I can return to the God of Israel. And this is what it's talking about in Psalm 44. It literally talks about these people who grew up in Babylon and were told, don't speak the name of your God. And instead they're calling out the names of Baal and Marduk and who knows what deities, right? Because they don't know any better. But in their hearts, they're turning their hearts towards the one true God, towards the God of Israel in innocence. And so I don't think God is striking people down because they're calling upon God with the wrong name. But it's still important to try to get it right if we can. Right? We've been captivated by this falsehood for 200 years, since 1833 when Gesenius wrote that. And now we have better information. Surely we should act on that better information. And we were talking before about, from your perspective in the New Testament, you've got Yeshua. And I know there's people who have been saved in the name of Jesus. They'll tell you it was on a certain date with a certain time. And you're not saying, Michael, right, to those people, hey, that salvation experience you had, that was false. You're not saying that, right?
No.
That's not the point. That's not the point we're making here. The point we're making here is, okay, you had that experience. God's that merciful that if you mispronounce his name, that he can still find you where you are. Even if you call him by a mispronunciation based on the name Jupiter, he can still respond to your prayer. He's that amazing, that merciful. But now that we know better, we should return to the truth, doing the best we can with this information as knowledge is being increased.